Howdy folks, HOSS BOSSMAN here to tell you about why money in politics is real bad. You ever wonder why the crux of our ideological divide, nominally in the United States anyway, is the size of government? Why would political parties and broader political ideologies be organized around this, of all ideas? Of course, people differ in their opinions of what would and would not make a good government. But that particular concern seems weirdly tertiary in this and many other Western countries. Since a wave of pro-corporate, hyper-capitalistic rhetoric and propaganda have taken hold among liberty-minded right-wing Americans, highly funded and thinly veiled as patriotic, individualistic libertarianism, though these forces of capital have been with us in some form since the dawn of capitalism itself. The traditionally workers' and human rights-oriented left has drifted further and further in this direction as well, due to a combination of the influence of money and corporate power and a cultural shift in this same direction. It might sound scary to some and superfluous and wasteful to others, but big government is a nonsense propaganda term designed to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. In truth, a sufficiently democratic government can and should be as big as it needs to be to provide for the basic needs and safety of its citizenry. And a sufficiently small government is more susceptible to the sort of corruption and rot we have in the US, which only serves to undermine democracy. I remember when I first learned what a lobbyist was. You mean to tell me that there's a legitimate legal profession, an entire class of people who sweet talk and bribe politicians on behalf of massive corporations, billionaires, and basically capitalism itself, and this has just been the way it is in America for all of modernity, and we still have the balls to call ourselves a democracy? Of course, I'd learn later that it's not quite that simple. Labor unions and even some progressive causes also employ lobbyists, but as far as I can tell, there are way fewer of them, and of course, there's no question that they have far fewer resources, less money, and less institutional power than their corporate counterparts. Furthermore, the only reason these benevolent lobbyists need to exist in the first place is to counteract the disastrous effects of all the money and influence pouring in from military contractors, credit card companies, oil companies, insurance companies, banks, conservative and libertarian think tanks, PACs, individual billionaires. I could go on. Call me crazy, but I think that voters, not corporations, should be the main determiner of who runs the government in a democracy. What would the almighty founding fathers think? Praise be to America's daddies, the infallible god kings who baked liberty and capitalism into the fabric of reality. They created a system that gave control of the government to the governed, right? Well, to their credit, most of the founders of the United States would almost certainly be appalled at the way politicians and government officials of all sorts have gotten all twisted up with one another. But not for the same reasons you and I probably object to in the current paradigm. As you can clearly tell from their attire choices, the founders were a bunch of hoity-toity fancy boys, and asking for money from wealthy donors, businesses, or a bunch of small individual donations from the unwashed masses, a la Bernie Sanders in 2015, 2016, and 2019, 2020, would have been considered extremely uncouth and unbecoming. I have to think that latter one, depending on the donations of the proletariat, would have been considered especially unthinkable. So how did they fund their campaigns? Well, as should be surprising to no one who knows that many of the founders were slave owners, and avoided this somewhat important fact when writing their immortal document about equality for all, for understandable reasons, explicitly made it so that only their gender and class were able to vote, as you probably already know, and concocted a bizarre minority rule system like the Electoral College. The Founding Fathers were completely fine with the prospect that only wealthy people would ever have the resources to run for political office. This way, despite all the rhetoric about men being created equal and whatnot, control of the American government could remain firmly within the grasp of the landed gentry. Side note, in researching this video, I found out that George Washington gave out free whiskey to potential voters, essentially exchanging goods for votes, which would be illegal today. Not that that would stop anyone from doing it now. Now, the way we got from that undesirable situation to the unsustainable nightmare we find ourselves in today is a story for another day. A history of money and politics video would be interesting. But today, I'm just going to try and illustrate the gravity of the situation, drive home how severe the intertwining of corporate interests and the state have become in the United States, explain why it matters, and hopefully give you some ammo when you're trying trying to radicalize your lib friends and relatives. Maybe even some factoids and arguments to drop on right-wingers who understand the corruption in the Democratic Party on some level because they consume propaganda in the form of conservative talk radio, Fox News, or perhaps something more sinister and insane, but also because of this very propaganda are under the delusion that this corruption is confined to the Democrats, when in reality it's even worse among Republicans. I'll actually crunch the numbers at some point, but from what I know, it appears that about 100% of Republican elected officials are bought and paid for by wealthy business interests, whereas only about 98% of Democrats are. There are probably some exceptions and complications, but I think this generalization will serve us well for now. Why money and politics shouldn't dance in a democracy. I feel like this should go without saying, but it's not great for politicians to be paid by the massive corporations and billionaires they should be regulating and taking sensible amounts of taxes from for the benefit of society as a whole. The bait and switch of libertarians, Republicans, and an increasing majority of supposed progressives and liberals, basically anyone who echoes the criminally misleading and destructive axiom that government is best which governs least. To someone like me, who's always had strong anti-authoritarian impulses, values his own individuality, and perceives boundless beauty in the diversity of human beings on this doomed planet, this seemed like a pretty attractive idea when I first heard it without context. More freedom? More personal autonomy, encouraging self-reliance and creativity, unleashing human potential, embracing the diversity of our species. These are the general values, which seem inherently good to many modern Americans, that initially attract people to this deceptive ideology. Keep in mind that the people who claim to champion these values through the reduction of government and the continued expansion of unfettered capitalism don't seem to have a problem with the fact that the United States houses roughly 22% of the world's prisoners, despite only comprising about 4% of the planet's total population. How do they square those stated values with this fact, which should alarm us all to the point of taking to the streets until it's no longer a reality? A combination of self-deception, outward propaganda, and cognitive dissonance would be my guess. How do you keep yourself from talking about this travesty nonstop? How do I? I don't know. I guess I'm coping by making this video and fooling myself into thinking it might make some kind of small difference. The massive, should be completely obvious problem with small government conservatism is that it doesn't take into account that, to perhaps oversimplify it a bit, shrinking the role of government in our lives leaves a power vacuum that corporations can and have enthusiastically filled in this country. In fact, via various means, moneyed interests actively fund and push propaganda specifically intended to falsely equate small government with liberty, to brainwash the public into eagerly advocating for the burgeoning of this vacuum. A phrase I use a lot in these discussions, which I came up with and patented, so you can't use it, and someday people will post this quotation on Facebook or whatever social media site is in vogue when I'm dead, complete with quotation marks on either side and a hyphen followed by my fake name. I'd rather have a big government controlled by the people than a small one controlled by corporations. We need government institutions to keep wealthy business interests from growing uncontrollably, monopolizing, abusing their employees, screwing over their customers, destroying the environment, and generally becoming the unaccountable tyrants they currently are in this and many other countries. Certainly, we should be vigilant about the very real prospect of a tyrannical government. But since we supposedly live in a democracy, we're supposed to have mechanisms aimed at changing the way our government operates and electing politicians and all that stuff, right? You know, with that whole voting thing. When it comes to the corporations that have bought off virtually all our politicians and have a stranglehold on the system itself, no such mechanisms exist. A free market fundamentalist might suggest we vote with our business or vote with our dollars and simply refrain from patronizing these companies, but that's not really an option when companies have monopolies, where one company has a particular market to themselves, and or oligopolies, where a small handful of companies control their respective markets or industries. By the way, most industries in the US comprise oligopolies or effective monopolies, but we're spiraling toward a future where Disney owns all media and communication outlets and Koch Industries owns every other commodity. Until one of them buys the other, that is, I guess. The Gravel Institute has a great video on this big government nonsense called Is Big Government Really the Problem?, which you should definitely check out. HOSS definitely recommends. The Gravel Institute, in general, good YouTube channel. If you've ever seen the bullshit peddled by the Prager University YouTube channel, which is a right-wing, free market propaganda outlet funded by fracking billionaires, the Gravel Institute is basically its reality-based counterpart. 5 to 10 minute videos succinctly explaining super important concepts that we're often lied to about, presented by cool lefties. Is Big Government Really the Problem? Is presented by former Bernie Sanders National Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray, whom I talk about in my video Debate Brain Thoughts or Debate Roundup or something like that. It's a recent video. It's like 3 or 4 videos ago. Howdy again, Future Hoss here with a highly sexually charged edition of Insertion Time. Just a couple things. I watched some PragerU videos, which I think I'd seen before that were on this topic, and they are hilariously anemic. I mean, PragerU always comes with some weak shit, but these videos, which are linked in the description, are, I hesitate to say on another level, but they are very, very weak. Basically, their whole thing comes down to this victim narrative about obscenely wealthy people and corporations. It may seem like calling money free speech and thinking of corporations as people with constitutional rights is some weaselly nonsense, but actually, it's not. That's basically what their argument boils down to. I guess this shit is supposed to work on people who don't know they're watching a propaganda channel. Granted, the videos I found on this subject were like 5 or 6 years old, but they don't seem to have addressed the topic since then. Maybe they were just finding their footing. Also, I realized while editing this that I don't really give any specific examples of this issue. This video is supposed to be a general overview, and I mostly just said all the stuff I already knew about this topic and double-checked and read a few articles to refresh myself. And you can find lots of specifics in the description, but here are 3 mind-blowing facts about money and politics. Factoid 1. Between 1998 and 2014, the top 12 lobbying groups spent about $3.7 billion, and that's out in the open. Of all 12 of those groups, only one of them was not a business interest, AARP, which makes sense because old people have always been a large special interest group, which also makes sense because everybody who survives adulthood gets old. Why does this only go to 2014? Well, there is more up-to-date information on this. OpenSecrets.org is sort of the go-to for this sort of thing, but this topic doesn't really get a lot of attention. I found a National Review article from 2019 that's complete nonsense. They have the gall to claim that Koch Industries was only the 23rd highest contributor to the 2020 election cycle at the time of publication, when it's been thoroughly documented that Koch specifically funneled their money through all sorts of serpentine means. These numbers are always difficult to completely ascertain. That's why it's called dark money. Anyway, here's something newer. Factoid 2. All in all, American candidates, Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, spent about $14 billion in the 2020 election cycle, which is roughly double what they spent in 2016. One more little factoid here. Delaware, the state for which Joe Biden was a senator most of his career, has been a super corporate-friendly state for over 100 years. Since the early 1980s, it's become especially well known as the ideal place to headquarter a credit card company. One such credit card company, called MBNA, is documented to have given over $200,000 to Joe Biden over the course of his career. And in a complete coincidence that's probably meaningless, good old Hunter Biden was hired by this very company. And also, Joe Biden voted to repeal Glass-Steagall, a Depression-era law that barred banks from owning securities and insurance businesses in 1999, which MBNA and every other credit card company happened to have been lobbying hard to have repealed for a long time. Many experts agree that repealing the Glass-Steagall Act was one of the key causes of the 2008 financial crash. I read all about this in a Mother Jones article from last year, linked in the description. Okay, that's enough specifics. Let's end this edition of Insertion Time and get back to past Hoss. I remember mentioning to a liberal friend, whom I won't name here but knows who they are, something about the corporate control of our government. It was an offhand remark in which I simply acknowledged that Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign was entirely funded by small individual donors, pointing out that this set him apart from the rest of the people vying for the Democratic nomination, besides Marianne Williamson and Tom Steyer, I guess, but that latter one's a technicality. Also, I should point out that Elizabeth Warren is far less corrupt in this regard, though she has accepted money from corporate interests in the past. My liberal friend responded with skepticism, seeming to be under the impression that the sort of corruption that people who decry the problem of money in politics are generally referring to was largely confined to the Republican Party. Certainly, Republicans are more brazen and blatant about this sort of corruption, as it's basically built into their party's platform. But make no mistake, Democratic elected officials' campaigns are also largely funded by the very industries we elect them to regulate and hold accountable. I imagine most Democrats would say that raising funds from the donor class is the only way they can stand a chance against their openly big business friendly and big business funded Republican opponents. And they're probably right in most cases. However, Bernie Sanders demonstrated in 2020 that a national campaign can be funded purely by small individual donations. Donations from actual voters. Human beings, no less. What can we do about it? Those of you who are familiar with my podcast, Breadsheet, which happens to be released weekly on all major podcast platforms and features interviews with such luminaries on the left as Philosopher King Ben Burgess, comedian, Knowledge Fight co-host, and the Quiet Part Loud author Jordan Holmes, Daily Zeitgeist, aka King, Christy Yamaguchi Main, and an ever-growing list of friends of the show.
Which also includes Rachel Kaworki Shank and Pansy Division's Chris Freeman, and Media Roots Radio's Robbie Martin, and Left Reckoning's David Griswam. Sorry, this footage might be kind of old.
Breadsheet, where I get out my brain thoughts, publish exclusive original music, and chat with kick-ass peeps in funny, profound, or at least amusing ways. Anyway, I like to ask guests the perhaps pointless and lame question, if you could wave a magic wand and instantly change one thing about the US government, what would it be? It makes for some fun chatting, and my answer to this question is usually get money out of politics. It's difficult to imagine all the various ways this would transform the dynamics of politics in the United States, and I do believe it would solve a number of problems virtually overnight. However, I'm under no illusions that it would magically solve all of our nation's myriad crises. Just look at the UK. The United Kingdom places strict limits on the amounts politicians can spend, though they apparently don't limit how much people can contribute to campaigns. Not sure how that works, but the point is that the British system has far better policies around this issue, and it hasn't stopped them from going to shit in ways that parallel our own horrible situation. So that's a little crash course on money in politics and why it's real bad. As I record this, Joe Biden has officially become our president-elect, which is good news, certainly a lot better than Trump. And on this particular issue, Joe Biden is not great. Neither is Kamala Harris, but under a Trump presidency, the only things that can happen with this issue are bad. And they'll probably continue to get worse with Biden. Unless we speak up, Republican, Democrat, whatever. We need to address this problem. This is an issue that I think a lot of people on the left and the right, center, wherever you are in the spectrum, you can get behind. You can learn more about it by looking at some of the sources I used for this video in the description. Those are all linked down there. Please give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you hated this. And subscribe to my channel, hit the little bell thingy. Follow me at HOSS_BOSSMAN on Twitter and Instagram. And I think that's going to about do it for me for today. Oh, you can also go to www.hoss.fun for all of your Hoss needs. And one more time, make sure you check out my podcast, Breadsheet. I love it and put a lot of love, care, tenderness into it, so I hope you enjoy it. Make sure you flood another sentient being's soul with healing light energy today. Hoss out.